The Dharma, incomparably profound and exquisite, is rarely met with even in hundreds of thousands of millions of kalpas. We can see it, hold it, and wait a minute, let's start again. This Dharma, incomparably profound and exquisite, is rarely met with even in hundreds of thousands of millions of years. We can see it, hear it, accept and hold it. May we realize the true mind of the Tathagata. Today is November 2nd, 2021. And I hesitate to say the last day of Sesshin because this is an intensive dual Sesshin training period. So this is the last day of the first Sesshin, but it is not by any means the last day of the training period. And as we continue with this training period, our practice, assuming we go as expected and go with our intentions, will go deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper. Far more deep than if we were to do this Sesshin and then wait another whole month for the next Sesshin. When we do these Sesshins in quick succession, we don't have a chance to really come back to a sort of a more shallow level of practice in between, if we're very careful, because Sunday night, the 7th, is when this next Sesshin begins. So that's 5 days from here. We have tremendous potential. We human beings don't realize necessarily the potential that we do have. But as we come into this world, we take birth in this seeming world, we have chosen our parents for whatever reason. There's an affinity clearly with the parents, whether it be a negative affinity, a positive affinity, or simply a relatively more neutral affinity. And then we have our life experiences based on that choice. Our parents, if we're fortunate, are caring, loving, deeply protective, but not helicopter protective parents, aware of the ways children grow and allowing them to grow and develop as their own being, instead of insisting upon these children that they become the person that their parents wanted to be themselves, which is often the unconscious motivation in much parenting, unfortunately, completely disregarding any karmic propensities their child might have. It's kind of interesting to note that sometimes this comes out in very strong ways with adopted children. I had a student in California who was adopted. And as she grew up, she discovered that the music that she loved to listen to and play was not at all the same type of music that her adoptive parents did. And her choices of things to do did not mesh very well with her adoptive parents either. And it wasn't a case of resistance or a case of teenage rebellion or anything like that. When she finally was able to reconnect with her birth parents, she discovered they all loved the same type of music, and they all had the same interesting sidelines. She had a couple of brothers who rebuilt classic cars, and she herself was a classic car enthusiast and actually rebuilt. She had the fortune to have a very wealthy husband and was able to buy a couple of, I think they were Peugeots, but I'm not sure, and have them completely refurbished to be just like new. That was her interesting thing to do. And there were many commonalities. But be that as it may, as we come into this life, we do have propensities. We have sort of a trajectory in a way, and we're drawn to certain things. And hopefully they will lead us to Zen. But along the way, we develop conditioning. It's impossible to not become conditioned, and there's nothing super wrong with conditioning. It's important for us to recognize that if we cross the street at the wrong time, we may end up in a cemetery rather rapidly, instead of whatever destination we had in mind as we were setting out across the street. If we obliviously go down the wrong alley in the dark, not bothering to pay attention to warnings, and we get attacked in that dark alley, we have to have some level of conditioning. I know a woman who had a kensho and decided to test it. Unfortunately, it wasn't a super complete kensho. Otherwise, I don't believe she would have done this. But she lived in San Francisco, and she decided to go down to Castro district and get into a seedy hotel. And I ended up having to jump out of a second-story window to avoid being, heaven knows what, by a couple of guys. Conditioning helps us in many ways. In our culture, we understand what is acceptable in behavior and what is not, for example. And it helps to keep us safe. It helps to keep us included. However, it can get extreme. We can get so invested in wanting to be part of the group or whatever that we end up denying ourselves, denying our true nature. All the way through, we experience challenges, we experience pain, mental, at least, emotional, and perhaps also physical. The mental emotional pain is because, as the Buddha himself so cogently realized, comes through wanting things to be a certain way, needing things, we feel a need to have things a certain way. An addict is an extreme version of this. Everything fades in importance except the need to get that next hit. And but we have many, even if we're not addicted to something, and we're addicted to a self-image, and that self-image has to be supported. It has to be defended. It gets embarrassed, and we get angry or ashamed. And in general, it creates challenge in our lives. Human beings seek out pleasure and try to avoid pain. That's the bottom line. And in doing so, we can get rather rigid, and we can get into mind states that increase the pain. And it can be a kind of a crummy way to live. But as the Buddha experienced himself, there is a way out. he laid it out, the whole thing, in the Four Noble Truths. Life is characterized by dukkha, is what the term is in Sanskrit. And what that refers to is things out of balance, like a wheel where the axle is worn in such a way that the wheel goes catarwacky and the cart goes lumpity along. Or it also can express anything between mild discomfort to extreme anguish. And I've yet to meet anybody who hasn't experienced some level of that gradient in their life, and many times over. It's the human condition, and it's caused by clinging, by wanting things to be a certain way. You don't want that person that you really care about to leave your life. And yet, even if they stick with you to the end of their life, they still die. You don't want that person to be around you if they're unpleasant, if they're abusive. And hopefully you're able to do something about that. You don't want to eat this. You do want to eat that. And maybe those things are either the only thing available or not available. What comes to mind is Xing Yan, the Chinese, contemporary Chinese Chan master, deeply realized Chan master, who grew up in a family so poor that they had to eat weeds. That's all they had. They were, they rented land to farm on for a while until there was a big flood and the land was swept away. And he, being the youngest child in the family, it was his duty to go out and try to find weeds for the family to eat. With the result that he was so malnourished, and I suspect the rest of the family was as well, that he was taken as quite dull-witted, which is interesting because eventually he got a PhD. But when he was 13, he was so dull-witted, and the family was so desperate as to what to do with this child as he grew up, that they were preparing to marry him off to another young dull-witted neighbor and hope for the best. When a Buddhist priest who was friends with the mom was a devout Buddhist, and Kuan Yin was somebody big in her life, the Bodhisattva of compassion. And once in a long while, this priest would come to visit, and when he heard of the plans, he said, well, why don't you just send him to the monastery instead? So they did. And at first he had a devil of a time learning the sutras because he was so, his lack of nourishment growing up had affected the development of his brain, basically. And so he couldn't remember things. And finally, he decided to ask Kuan Yin for support and pledged to do 500 prostrations a day, which is a tremendous amount of prostrations. And in hopes that she would grant him or help him learn the sutras. And we know from modern medicine and neurology that 500 prostrations is quite an exercise, and exercise positively impacts the brain. It makes BDNF, brain-derived neurotrophic factor, increase, which increases the cellular ability of the brain to function. And that's what happened. He was able eventually to learn these sutras. And of course, the temple that he was in was one that focused on reciting sutras. One other thing that this expresses is the potential for change. We human beings assume that we're locked into a fixed structure. And in certain ways we are, although even now, in modern times, people are able to change sex. There doesn't seem to be any real limitation to what human bodies can do. And life is change. We are filled with potential. And that potential includes becoming able to open to the profound depths of reality. Because our conditioned experience, our assumptions, our attachment to a self-image, our stubbornness at staying in a particular track, for example, a particular set of beliefs is not necessarily a helpful thing. To become truly awakened is to become able to, as is commonly said, travel through the 6 realms in a samadhi of innocent delight. The 6 realms, of course, are the 6 realms of existence, and they range all the way from hell through hungry ghosts, fighting demons, human realm, the heavenly realm, the God realm, and so on. So every one of us travels through those realms many times during a day, or usually. Our mind state is sometimes quite happy and at ease. Sometimes it's frustrated, sometimes it's angry, sometimes it's upset, sometimes it feels terrible, as if it's in hell. Sometimes we feel okay, but we're attached to those mind states, and we try to get out of the unpleasant ones rather than go in, allowing ourselves to embrace the experience, the physical experience of that mind state. And when we do that, it dissolves, assuming we can open fully to the physical experience of it. As long as we stay in our heads, so to speak, and talk about it to ourselves and try to tell ourselves something different, or trying to make ourselves go into a different mind state, it's doomed to repetition. But if we can do, as Longchenpa said, tune in to the body sensations in the first moment that they come up and stay present in the experience without judgment, without having to have it different. Of course, you can feel the need to want it different, but if you feel it as a bodily sensation until it dissolves, it will dissolve. And then right in the midst of whatever that mind state was, you're free. And this is why we can say in the guided loving kindness meditations, may I be free from anger in the midst of anger. May I be free from frustration in the midst of frustration. Because it is possible to be free from whatever it is in the midst of it. Supposedly, during one of the wars in Japan, where the samurai were fighting against each other, there was one segment that it came into a monastery searching for somebody who had been on the other side and done something wrong. I don't recall the details. At any rate, the master and the monks were all upstairs in the Sanmon, the triple gate, except for one monk who happened to be out of the temple on some errand. And when the opposing military forces came into the temple, they actually recognized that the community was hiding up there. And at a certain point in time in Japanese history, those sanmon were places of hiding. It's sort of like a house built on top of a gate, quite big, quite wide. And on either side of this structure, there are stairways leading up, quite long, angled, well, rather steep stairways. But at a certain point in each of those stairways, one has to duck so low that your chest almost scrapes the step in order to pass through. And that's so that anybody upstairs who doesn't want you up there can whack you and prevent you from coming up. So what they did was they set fire to the place instead. And as the monks began to realize that they were going to burn to death, one of them cried out to the master and said, "Oh no, we're going to burn to death. Oh. And the master said, "When one is awakened, even fire is refreshing." And there's another story from Burma that I learned many, many years ago when I was living there. There used to be a kingdom. It was a kingdom of Burma, or Myanmar, actually. That was the traditional name back then, and they've re-upped it now. And the British, of course, took over and exiled the last king and his court to an island off of somewhere out to sea. I don't know. Never knew where it was exactly, but we did get to know the remaining royal personage, a princess who was, I don't know if she's an infant or a very small child at the time, Princess Malat. But these kings were allowed 4 wives. That seems to be a traditional number of wives for Southeast Asian men. And the same is true, or was true at least in Thailand when we were living there. Legally, a man could have 4 wives. He only had to treat them equally. Well, this king in Burma had 4 wives, and his principal wife angered him by something she said or did. And who knows what it was? It's not recorded as far as I know. But he got so furious at her that he sentenced her to death. Nice way to treat a wife. And it says something about the guy. At any rate, in order to keep her captive until he could kill her, and she was to be burnt to death, he had her enclosed in a cage. And eventually that cage was on top of a pyre, and she was burnt to death. But I think she had a 2-week reprieve until that happened. And a Buddhist monk went to visit her every day, taught her how to do zazen, taught her how to go incredibly deep. And of course, she must have been deeply motivated. And so, like the Buddhist monks in Vietnam who immolated themselves in resistance to the war and just sat there immovable as their bodies were engulfed in flames, which had to be incredibly painful. And so the day came, the fire was set, and she sat there in zazen. She didn't scream and carry on. freak out. She simply sat quietly in meditation. And of course, that further angered the king, but he wasn't able to do anything more about it because he'd already condemned her to death. These are extreme situations that have shown us that there is a possibility that even in the midst of extremity, we can become free of investment in a self-image that is suffering. And that goes for physical pain, mental, emotional pain, you name it. When we practice deeply enough, we are open to this recognition that there's nobody to be defended. Just as Shiro Unan recognized when he was brought this infant and accused of fathering it, which was a lie. He hadn't done that. And that was proven a year later when the young mother confessed who the father really was. He felt no need to fight, no need to object, no need to run away. He was so clear and so let go in his mind that what came up instead for him was compassion for the family in their deep embarrassment. Because back then in Japan, nobody had children out of wedlock. And he simply received the child and raised the child. It's really hard for us to comprehend his mind state, but it was a real mind state. It was truly let go, and it is the same mind state any one of us can open to, such that no matter what happens to us, there's not a problem. We don't shut down. We don't get angry. We don't need to get angry. We simply understand from a profound and clear level how to respond to the situation. This is what our practice can offer us. It's a very deep level of practice. It's not one ordinarily spoken of, at least not in these terms, in modern America, but it is possible. And you can do it. And let me share with you, as in hopes that this might spur you in that direction, these words of Obaku, who was Rinzai's master. All Buddhas and all ordinary beings are nothing but the one mind. This mind is beginningless and endless, unborn and indestructible. One of the biggest fears of human beings is death. And it's in sometimes gross levels, sometimes more subtle. This afternoon, one of my sisters texted me and asked when our grandmother was when she, quote, had her heart attack. The thing is, our grandmother had 3 heart attacks. She had recognized at the time. She was an infant. In fact, she was already born, but not much more than that when grandmother had her first heart attack. And she said, 3? And of course, our mother had also died of a massive heart attack. As far as we know, she only had one great big huge one, but there's a possibility that every year this thing she called the flu actually was a small heart attack. So there was a sense that when my sister was saying 3, and my sister is about the same age as our grandmother was when she did have that heart attack, that first heart attack, there was a sense that there was some fear of death. And as we get older, we do fear death. But far before that, we fear death. Not necessarily the death of the body, but we fear the death of the ego, the death of the self-image. Take a moment and think about what will happen, which is you will die. Just take a moment and open to that possibility. How will it be, as the verse in the koan goes, when the light of your eyes is falling? How is it right now when you're thinking about it? This is a good exercise. And if you tune in to any tweak of anxiety or fear, this is a good sign. Because as Shirobunan said, if you die before you die, you won't die when you die. And that abbot up there in the top of the burning Sanmon clearly had died before he was about to die. Clearly he had experienced what's called the Great Death. In reality, we do not die, yet everybody here has likely seen, if you haven't yet, you will, a dead body. Some of us have seen many of them, and seen many of them recognizing that there's been various different levels of acceptance of death in those bodies, various different levels of resistance to dying. The elderly ladies, elderly Catholic ladies in Rochester who died clutching their crucifixes, their bodies writhed for literally hours after they died, as if they were trying desperately to stay alive. Why? If our mind is undying and indestructible, what is it we haven't yet recognized? It is increasingly important, the older we get, to recognize that deeply enough so that, like Roshi Kapleau, when we die, we'll simply be no longer breathing in. No struggle, no objection, simply acceptance of moving on. All Buddhas and ordinary beings are nothing but the one mind. This mind is beginningless and endless, unborn and indestructible. It has no color or shape, neither exists nor doesn't exist. Isn't old or new, long or short, large or small, since it transcends all measures, limits, names, and comparisons. It is ordinary. It is why you see in front of you. It's what you see in front of you. Start to think about it, and immediately you're mistaken. Start to think about it, and immediately you're mistaken. It is beyond words, but it is the most profound reality that is. The rest of it is, in essence, a charade. And because large communities gather in conjunction with the story of that charade, we conceive of reality as being whatever that charade is. And one of the challenges in human life these days is that there are many different charades, and some of them are in opposition to each other. And so things happen and pain takes place. But there's another aspect of that, and that is the deeper we go in our practice, the more let go we are in our life, the more we are able to tune in when things feel off or challenging or something that we don't like, and stay present with that physical experience until it dissolves. It is an amazing experience when you get it down. And you can use it with anything. But as we continue this, our behavior changes, our attachments begin to dissolve. And in that dissolution, not only are we a model for others, but at unseen levels, that ever more clear mind state is communicated wordlessly to all that is. Let's continue with Obaku. Start to think about it and immediately you're mistaken. It's like the boundless void which can't be fathomed or measured. The one mind is the Buddha, and there is no distinction between Buddha and ordinary beings, except that ordinary beings are attached to forms and thus seek Buddhahood outside themselves. By this very seeking, they lose it, since they're using Buddha to seek for Buddha, using mind to seek for mind. And this is why in our practice, it's about opening to possibility. It's not about trying to get into a particular physical or mental state. It's the cat sitting quietly, focused at the mouse hole, waiting for the mouse to come up. Not tense. If you've ever watched a cat stalking, it's incredibly relaxed. And we don't have to be relaxed necessarily to do the practice. We just have to be present. And if that means there's backaches or muscle tension, then there's backaches fully felt, muscle tension fully experienced, without trying to get rid of any of it. This is what Longchenpa says: tune in to the inner essence of this experience. Don't try to push it away. Don't try to get rid of it. Don't try to change it. That's where you get the attachment reinforced. So, although this is the last day of this particular sesshin, it's not the last day of this intensive training period. And while tomorrow is a free day, hopefully we will use that free day to get extra rest, maybe some extra exercise, maybe some extra zazen, and continue into the next week ready to super dive even deeper as that next sesshin unfolds. This practice is truly bodhisattvic. First, it shows us where we're caught, and then it sets us free. And the sticky part is not getting caught with the idea of being caught, but rather to tune in, experience it, allow it to be, without trying to make it different. So I thank you for listening. I'll stop now and recite the 4 vows.